Silas Thorne checked his silver pocket watch, irritated. The drive had taken 20 minutes longer than he'd budgeted for dumping two children in the snow. The engine of his Ford idled with a rough cough, spewing gray exhaust into the iron-cold air of the Dakotas. Beside him, the twins, Elias and Miriam, sat in silence. They hadn't spoken a single word since leaving the city orphanage. They were 12 years old, skinny as rails, with the kind of haunted, hollowed-out eyes that made comfortable people look away. But Silas didn't look away. He didn't look at them at all. His eyes were fixed on the deed, tucked securely in his breast pocket. "Get out," Silas said. It wasn't a shout. It was a flat, business-like command, the same tone a man uses to order a muddy dog off the furniture. Elias pushed the heavy door open. The wind hit them instantly. A Great Plains razor wind that didn't just chill the skin, but seemed to cut right through to the marrow. Miriam followed, clutching a small, threadbare rucksack that contained everything they owned in the world. They stood shivering in the knee-deep snow, staring at their inheritance. It was a skeleton of a farm. The main house had burned down years ago, leaving nothing but a blackened stone foundation capped with jagged ice. The only structure still standing was a massive, sagging barn. Its roof was swayed like the back of an old horse, and the timber siding was gray and rotted, full of gaps that looked like missing teeth. It wasn't a shelter. It was a wind tunnel. "Your great-uncle was a fool who died owing money to everyone in the county," Silas said, stepping out of the car and buttoning his expensive wool coat against the bite of the frost. He didn't hand them a key because there were no doors to lock. Instead, he pointed a gloved finger toward the ruin. "But the law says this dirt is yours until you turn 18, or until you're gone." He walked to the trunk of the car, pulled out a rusted axe and a coil of stiff, frozen rope, and threw them at Elias's feet. Then he pointed to the barn. "3 cows are inside, part of the estate. Keep them alive. If the livestock dies, the asset value drops, and I'll be very displeased when I come back for the inspection." Miriam looked at the man who had signed the adoption papers just 3 days ago. She saw no warmth in his face, only a predatory calculation. "Inspection?" she asked, her voice trembling against the gale. "You aren't staying?" Silas let out a sharp, dry laugh that vanished instantly in the wind. "Me? Stay in this rot? No, girl. I have business in town. I'm the legal guardian, not the babysitter. You wanted a home? This is it. Prove you can handle the responsibility." He didn't leave them food. He didn't leave them money. He didn't even leave them a match to start a fire. "Don't try walking to town," Silas warned, his hand on the car door. "It's 20 miles, and a blizzard is rolling in from the north. You'd be frozen statues before you hit the main road. Stay with the cows. Their body heat is the only charity you're going to get." With that, he climbed back into the warmth of the car. The tires spun on the ice for a moment, whining loudly before gripping the frozen mud. The car lurched forward, taillights glowing like 2 red demon eyes in the gathering dusk before disappearing over the ridge. Silence rushed back in, heavy and suffocating. Elias looked at his sister. His lips were already turning blue. "He didn't adopt us, Miriam," he whispered, the realization settling in his gut, heavier than the cold. "He brought us here to finish what the winter started." Miriam stared at the tire tracks fading in the blowing snow. She looked at the rotting barn that groaned under the assault of the wind. She realized Silas Thorne hadn't just left them at a farm. He had left them in a grave. "This isn't a shelter," Elias said, his voice cracking as the wind shrieked through the gaps in the siding like a banshee. He stomped his boots on the dirt floor. trying to bring feeling back to toes that were already numb. The roof is sagging over the main beam. 1 foot of heavy snow, and this whole place comes down on top of us. Miriam didn't answer. She was pacing the perimeter of the barn, her eyes scanning the floor with a feverish intensity. She wasn't looking at the holes in the roof. She was looking at the ground. She walked with a strange, intense focus, dragging the heel of her boot against the packed dirt and rotting floorboards. "Miriam, hush," she hissed. She stopped near the center of the barn, where the remnants of an old hayloft cast a deep shadow. She crouched down, pressing her bare palm against the dirt-encrusted wood. "The draft," she whispered, her eyes widening. "It's coming up, not just in." Elias knelt beside her. She was right. Through the hairline cracks of the floorboards, a faint, cool, but not freezing air was seeping up. It smelled different than the acrid ammonia of the barn. It smelled of earth and stone, damp but stable. It smelled like the deep, quiet places of the world where the wind couldn't reach. Miriam grabbed the edge of a rotted plank and pulled. It snapped with a wet crunch. Beneath it wasn't dirt, it was wood. Oak, thick and dark. She swept away the layer of old straw and muck, revealing the outline of a heavy, iron-bound trapdoor. It was flush with the floor, nearly invisible if you didn't know what you were looking for. A recessed iron ring lay in the center, rusted into its groove. "Help me," she commanded. Elias hooked his fingers through the ring alongside hers. "On 3, 1, 2, 3. They heaved, their boots slipping on the frozen earth. For an agonizing second, nothing happened. The rust held fast, the hinges seized by decades of neglect. Then, with a screech that sounded like a gunshot, the seal broke. The heavy oak door groaned upward, showering them with dust. They fell back, panting, as the door slammed open against the barn floor. They stared into the abyss. But it wasn't an empty black hole. A wooden ladder, sturdy and steep, descended into the gloom. Elias grabbed the kerosene lantern Silas had let them keep, one of his few mercies, and lit it with shaking hands. He lowered it into the opening. The amber light revealed a root cellar, but it was massive, an old-style storm cellar built by sod-busters who feared twisters and hard winters more than they feared God. The walls were lined with fieldstone, fitted tight without mortar. The floor was packed earth, hard as concrete. "It's dry," Elias breathed, the vapor of his breath dancing in the lantern light. "And the wind, it can't reach down there." Miriam was already moving. The discovery hadn't brought her relief. It had brought her purpose. "We have to move," she said, her voice sharp. "The storm is hitting in an hour. We need to get the cows down." Elias looked at the narrow trapdoor, then at the 3,000-pound Holsteins huddling in the corner, their black and white hides matted with frost. "Miriam, that hole is 3 feet wide. The ladder is too steep. Cows don't climb ladders. They'll break their legs." "Then we make it bigger," she said, grabbing the rusted axe Silas had thrown at them. She hefted it, the weight heavy in her thin arms, and we built a ramp. For the next hour they worked with a manic desperation that bordered on madness. They didn't speak. The sound of their labor was the only thing keeping the terror at bay. Elias took the axe, swinging it with a violence that surprised him. He smashed through the rotting floorboards surrounding the trapdoor, widening the opening until it was a gaping maw 6 feet square. The wood splintered and flew, exposing the cellar's depths. Next came the ramp. They scavenged the barn like vultures. They tore down the siding from the collapsed stalls, ripping nails out of the wood with the claw of a hammer Elias found on a workbench. They found thick, heavy planks, old oak that had hardened with age. They dragged a collapsed beam over to the hole to serve as a central support. It was crude, ugly work. They lashed the planks together with the frozen rope Silas had left, creating a steep, makeshift slope leading down into the dark. It looked dangerous. It looked impossible. But the wind outside was now a deafening howl, and snow was beginning to drive through the cracks in the walls, dusting the cows' backs with white powder. The temperature was dropping like a stone. If they stayed up here, they would be dead by morning. "It holds," Elias said, testing his weight on the ramp. It groaned but didn't bow. "I'll go down. You drive them." Getting the first cow to the edge was a war of attrition. The animal, a gaunt female with a tagged ear, planted her hooves and refused to budge. She rolled her eyes, terrified of the gaping hole in the floor and the smell of the damp earth rising from it. "Come on, girl," Miriam pleaded, pushing from behind, her shoulder jamming into the cow's flank. "It's warm down there. Please." The cow lowed a mournful sound and bucked. Elias, standing at the bottom of the ramp in the cellar, whistled. He held out a handful of the dry, musty hay they had found in the corner. Hey, look here." Maybe it was the hunger, or maybe the animal sensed the drop in barometric pressure that signaled the blizzard's fury was peaking. The cow took a tentative step, then another. Her front hooves hit the wood of the ramp. She slid, panicking for a second, her hooves scrabbling against the wood, but Miriam slapped her flank hard. "Go!" With a lurching slide, hooves creating sparks against the hidden nails, the cow skidded down the ramp. She hit the earthen floor of the cellar with a heavy thud, stumbled, and then righted herself. She shook her head, looking around. The air down here was still. It was 50 degrees. Balmy, compared to the sub-zero nightmare above. "One down," Elias yelled up, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "Next." By the time the third cow was down, the twins were drenched in sweat that was rapidly freezing on their skin. Their hands were raw, blistered from the axe handle and the rough hemp rope. But they were done. The barn above was empty, save for the howling wind. They threw the rest of the hay down, followed by their rucksacks. Elias climbed down last, his legs trembling from exhaustion. The cellar was expansive, extending well beyond the footprint of the barn above. In the amber glow of the lantern, it looked like a medieval hall. In the corner, a cast-iron potbelly stove sat covered in dust. Elias checked the flue. It ran up through the stone wall and exited somewhere on the side of the barn, likely hidden by bushes or snowdrifts. It was ingenious. Miriam didn't sit down. She climbed halfway back up the ramp. "What are you doing?" Elias asked, collapsing onto a pile of straw. "The trapdoor," Miriam said, her voice echoing in the stone chamber. "We have to close it. We widened it. The door doesn't fit anymore." "I know," she said. "Hand me those loose boards." She didn't just want to close it to keep the heat in. She began arranging the splintered debris they had hacked away, creating a false floor over the opening. She worked with the precision of a mason, layering the wood to cover the gap. She left only a small gap for air, hidden under a pile of rotted hay and manure she dragged over from the stalls. From the inside of the barn, looking down, it would look like a pile of refuse in a derelict building. A grave for the forgotten. "Miriam," Elias said, realizing what she was doing. "You're hiding us." She dropped the last board into place, sealing them in the gloom. The shrieking of the wind was instantly cut off, replaced by the heavy, rhythmic breathing of the cows and the settling groans of the earth. She climbed down the ramp, wiping the dirt from her hands. Her face was smudged with grime, but her eyes were clear and dangerous. "Silas thinks we're going to freeze tonight," she said, walking over to the stove. When he comes back, I want him to find a snowy grave. I want him to think the wind took us." She looked at the stove, then at Elias. "If he thinks we're dead, he stops looking. And if he stops looking, we have time to survive." Elias nodded slowly. The wind howled above them, a distant, muted rage that could no longer touch them. They were underground. They were ghosts. And for the first time since they got in the car with Silas Thorne, they had a weapon. Secrecy. "Let's get this fire started," Elias said. "We have a long night ahead." The blizzard didn't just pass over them. It settled on the land like a suffocating blanket of white iron. Above the trapdoor, the world was a screaming void of white noise and sub-zero wind. But down in the fortress, as Elias had started calling it, time moved to a different, slower rhythm. The twins quickly learned that survival wasn't about heroic gestures or dramatic speeches. It was about the grind. It was a game of calories and thermodynamics. The cellar settled into a hazy, amber-lit purgatory. The air grew thick, carrying the earthy musk of the cows, the sharp tang of wood smoke, and the damp, ancient scent of soil. It wasn't pleasant. It smelled like a wet dog wrapped in old wool. But to Elias and Miriam, it was the smell of life. "Check the flue," Miriam murmured from her spot near the stove. She was wrapped in a coarse horse blanket they'd scavenged, her face smudged with soot, looking like a diminutive coal miner. Elias was already moving. He adjusted the damper on the cast iron stove with the tip of the axe. They had to keep the fire hot enough to ward off the subterranean chill, but low enough that the smoke wouldn't billow out of the hidden chimney vent like a signal flare. It was a delicate, high-stakes dance. If the fire died, they froze. If it raged, Silas, or anyone else looking for a corpse, would see the smoke. "Draft is good," Elias said, tossing a prairie log into the firebox. It wasn't wood. It was a dried patty of cow manure. They had learned quickly that the old wood in the barn burned too fast and hot. The manure, disgusting as it was to handle initially, smoldered slow and consistent, a trick Elias remembered reading about in a history book regarding the Oregon Trail pioneers. Necessity had stripped away their squeamishness. Now fuel was just fuel. They had divided the cellar with military precision. The back half belonged to the girls, the 3 Holsteins. The cows had stopped shivering hours ago. In fact, the massive animals acted as living radiators, their bodies generating a steady, humid warmth that kept the cellar hovering around 50 degrees. At night, when the fire was banked low to conserve their limited fuel, Elias and Miriam didn't sleep on the straw mattress. They slept, curled up against the flank of the largest cow, a gentle beast they named Bessie. Her heartbeat was a slow, thumping lullaby that vibrated through their own ribs, a reminder that they weren't the only living things left in the universe. The front half of the cellar was the human zone. It contained the stove, the lantern, and their most precious discovery, the larder, tucked into a recessed alcove behind a rotting shelf. They had found a root bin. It wasn't a feast, just a crate of shriveled turnips, some potatoes that had gone soft and sprouted pale, alien-looking eyes, and a few jars of pickled beets that looked like they dated back to the First World War. "Dinner?" Miriam announced, placing 2 baked potatoes and a beet on the stove lid. They ate in silence, savoring the hot, starchy meal. It was bland, tasting of dust and time, but it filled the hollow ache in their stomachs. "We have food for maybe 2 weeks, Elias calculated, wiping his mouth with his sleeve. "If we ration, 1 potato a day, maybe half." "Silas will be back before then," Miriam said. She wasn't guessing, she was stating a fact. She pulled a small leather-bound ledger from her rucksack. She had found it in the barn's office before they went underground, an old farm record book with plenty of blank pages. Now it was her weapon. In the flickering lantern light, Miriam sharpened a pencil stub with a pocket knife. Her face was set in a mask of grim determination. Her handwriting was small, cramped, and meticulous. Day 4, she wrote. Storm still raging. Temperature in the cellar, approximately 55 degrees. Food stocks, low. Livestock condition, stable. Then she started a new paragraph. Her hand pressed harder into the paper, the graphite nearly tearing the sheet. Silas Thorne left us at 4 p.m. on Tuesday. He took the car. He left no food, no money, and no matches. He told us to stay in the barn. He knows the roof is collapsing. He did not provide winter coats. He is not a guardian. He is an executioner. Why do you keep writing that? Elias asked, watching her. Who's going to read it? We're ghosts, Miriam. Miriam looked up, her eyes reflecting the flame. They weren't the eyes of a 12-year-old girl anymore. They were the eyes of a prosecutor. The sheriff. The judge. Or the undertaker. Whoever finds us. She tapped the book with a dirty fingernail. This is the difference between an accident and a murder, Elias. If we die, this book hangs him. If we live, this book sends him to prison. Elias nodded slowly, a newfound respect for his sister swelling in his chest. He was the muscle, the engineer who kept the air flowing and the walls standing. But Miriam? Miriam was the architect of their justice. The psychological toll of the darkness began to set in on the 5th day. The constant twilight, the inability to stand up fully straight in some parts of the cellar, the fear of the ceiling collapsing, it clawed at their minds. To keep from going crazy, they worked. They groomed the cows with handfuls of straw until the animals' coats shone. They cleaned the floor, burying the waste in a deep pit Elias dug in the far corner. They told stories. They reinvented their pasts, pretending they weren't orphans from the city, but seasoned frontiersmen waiting out a bad season. But the fear of Silas was a cold specter that never left. One afternoon, the wind died down. The silence that followed was louder than the storm. The eye, Elias whispered. Maybe the end of it, Miriam replied. They crept up the ramp to the trapdoor. Through the small ventilation gap Miriam had engineered, a space no wider than a silver dollar hidden under the debris. A beam of pure, blinding, white sunlight pierced the gloom. It looked like a spotlight from heaven. It's over, Elias breathed, reaching for the latch. No, Miriam said, her voice tight, grabbing his wrist. Now the real danger starts. The roads will be cleared soon. He'll come back. She turned to her brother, her grip bruising. We have to be ghosts, Elias. No noise. Minimal smoke during the day. We only cook at night. If we hear a car, we douse the light immediately. Understood? Elias looked at the beam of light, yearning for the fresh air, then back at the dark safety of their hole. He realized that the world above, the world of adults, of laws, of guardians, was far more dangerous than the freezing dark below. Let him come, Elias said, his jaw setting into a hard line. He looked at the pitchfork leaning against the wall, sharp, heavy, and lethal. This is our farm now. Down in the earth, beneath the frost line, the twins weren't just surviving. They were hardening. Like coal under pressure, the fear was turning into something dense and combustible. They were waiting for the sound of an engine. They were waiting for Silas. The silence of the Great Plains winter is a deception. It feels like peace, but it is actually a predator holding its breath. Inside the cellar, the air was thick with the humid warmth of the livestock, and the rhythmic chewing of cud. It had been 20 days, 20 days of living like voles in the dirt. Miriam had marked the passage of time on the stone wall with a piece of charcoal, 4 clusters of 5 tally marks. "Do you hear that?" Elias whispered. He was scraping the last of the mold off a sprouted potato with his thumbnail. Miriam froze. Her ears, attuned to the subtle shifts of the barn's groaning timbers, picked up a new sound. It wasn't the wind, it was a low mechanical growl rising and falling with the terrain. A combustion engine. "The Ford," she said, her voice barely audible. "He's early," Elias said, scrambling to his feet, the potato forgotten. "The road shouldn't be passable yet." "He has chains on his tires," Miriam deduced, her mind racing. "And he has a shovel. He didn't come to visit Elias. He came to collect." "Douse the light." Elias blew out the lantern. The cellar plunged into a heavy, absolute darkness, save for the faint orange glow of the embers in the stove's belly. They moved by memory, stepping silently over the straw to the foot of the ramp. They stood there, 2 ghosts in the underworld, clutching their weapons, a pitchfork for him, the heavy iron poker for her. Above them, the heavy barn door creaked open. The sound echoed down the shaft like a gunshot. Heavy boots crunched on the frozen debris of the barn floor. Silas Thorne had returned. "Elias, Miriam?" His voice wasn't frantic. It was bored. It was the tone of a man looking for lost keys, not lost children. He walked further in, his footsteps heavy and arrogant. He wasn't moving with caution, he was moving with ownership. "Come on now," Silas called out, his voice dripping with false concern. "If you're huddled in a corner, speak up. I've got the heater running in the car." A pause, then a muttered curse. Freezing little rats, probably buried under a drift. Elias gripped the pitchfork until his knuckles turned white. Silas wasn't looking for survivors. He was looking for bodies to load into the trunk to show the probate judge. Tragic accident, succumbed to the elements. "Sign here, Mr. Thorne." Then the wind shifted. The blizzard that had been dormant for 2 days didn't just return, it roared back to life, with the ferocity of a wounded animal. It was an Alberta clipper. That's what the locals called these fast-moving, violent storm fronts that barrel down from Canada like a freight train. It slammed into the barn with hurricane-force pressure. The structure, already compromised and carrying tons of ice on its swayed roof, finally gave up the ghost. It started with a sound like a cracking whip, the main support beam snapping. Crack, boom! The noise was deafening. Above them the world came apart. The roof of the barn collapsed inward. Tons of snow, ice, and rotted timber came crashing down. The impact shook the cellar walls, sending dust raining down from the ceiling like mortar fire. The cows lowed in panic, scrambling in the straw, their heavy bodies thumping against the stone walls. "The vent!" Miriam hissed. "Check the vent!" But before Elias could move, they heard it. Not the wind. A scream. It was a human sound, ragged, terrified, and very close. "Help, my leg! God, help me!" Silas. He hadn't been crushed, but he was pinned. The collapse had trapped him inside the ruin, likely burying the exit and pinning him amidst the wreckage. Elias and Miriam stood paralyzed in the dark. The dynamic had shifted so violently it made their heads spin. A moment ago they were prey hiding in a hole. Now they were the masters of the fortress, and the wolf was caught in the teeth of the trap. The screaming above turned into sobbing. "Is anyone there? I'm stuck. It's cold. It's so cold." Elias looked at Miriam. In the dark he couldn't see her face, but he felt her resolve vibrating in the air. She walked up the ramp, careful not to make a sound. She reached the top, where the trapdoor was hidden under the debris she had so carefully arranged. She could hear him breathing now. He was right on top of them, separated only by 2 inches of oak and a layer of deception. "My leg," Silas whimpered, then silence. He was listening. The heat rises, even through the cracks. The warmth of the cellar, 50 degrees against the 20 below zero air outside, was leaking up. Silas must have felt it. A ghost of warmth on his freezing face. "What?" Silas's voice changed. It became sharp, suspicious. He started clawing at the debris. He was digging. "There's heat," he mumbled. "Fire, someone's here." He clawed away the straw Miriam had used for camouflage. He found the gaps in the false floor. He put his eye to the crack. From below, Miriam looked up. A single beam of faint light from the collapsed roof illuminated Silas's face. He looked deranged. His expensive fur hat was gone, his hair plastered to his forehead with melting snow and sweat. His eyes were wide, wild, and bloodshot. He saw them. He saw the dim red eye of the stove. He saw the healthy cows. He saw the twins standing warm and dry in their sanctuary. "You," Silas breathed, the shock momentarily overriding the pain. "You're alive." "Go away, Silas," Miriam said. Her voice was calm, devoid of fear. It traveled up through the floorboards like a judgment from the earth itself. "Open this!" Silas shouted, slamming his fist against the trapdoor. "Open this door right now. I am your legal guardian. I command you." "You abandoned your guardianship," Elias said, stepping up beside his sister. "You left us to die. You said this barn was ours. Well, we're in it." "I'm freezing!" Silas screamed, his voice cracking into a high-pitched panic. "My leg is broken. I can't get to the car. Open the door." "We can't," Miriam lied smoothly. "The debris, it's blocked." "You're lying. I can see the latch. Open it." He began to pound on the wood, but his blows were weak. The cold was already sapping his strength. The hypothermia that he had intended for them was now crawling into his own marrow. "You wanted the farm, Silas," Miriam said, consulting her mental ledger. "You wanted the assets. But you didn't want the work. You didn't want to fix the roof. You didn't want to feed the stock." "I'll give you the deed," Silas bargained, his teeth chattering violently. "I'll sign it over. Just let me down. It's warm. God, it looks so warm down there." He pressed his face against the crack, inhaling the scent of the manure fire like it was perfume. He was a drowning man, looking at air. "We don't need you to give it to us," Elias said. "Possession is 9/10 of the law. Isn't that what you said?" "Please." Silas wept. The arrogance was gone, stripped away by the wind. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I'm dying." Miriam looked at the latch. It was right there. One slide of the bolt, and she could save him. She could let him down into the light. He would drink their water, eat their turnips, and warm his hands by their fire. And then she remembered the look in his eyes when he threw the axe in the snow. She remembered the car driving away. She knew men like Silas. Gratitude didn't change them. It only made them resent the witness to their weakness. If he came down, the dynamic would flip again. He would be the adult, the owner, the survivor. They would just be the orphans again. Or would they? She looked at Elias. His face wasn't hard anymore. It was conflicted. He was holding the pitchfork, but his grip was loose. They weren't murderers. They were survivors. And there was a difference. "The storm is picking up, Silas," Miriam said, her hand hovering over the bolt. "Make your choice. If you come down here, you are not the master. You are the guest, and guests follow the rules. Silas sobbed, a broken, pathetic sound. Anything, just open the door. Miriam didn't hesitate. With a sharp metallic clack, she slid the rusted bolt back. Push, she commanded. Elias braced his shoulder against the oak planks and heaved. The trapdoor, heavy with the weight of the collapsed roof debris, groaned in protest. Dust and snow poured down through the widening crack, hissing as it hit the hot stove. With a final, straining grunt, they forced the door upward just enough to create a gap. A hand, frozen, blue, and trembling violently, clawed through the opening. "Grab him!" Elias yelled, the adrenaline overriding his own exhaustion. They weren't gentle. They couldn't afford to be. Elias grabbed Silas by the collar of his ruined wool coat, while Miriam gripped his good arm. They hauled him in like a sack of feed. Silas tumbled down the makeshift ramp, screaming as his broken leg bumped against the wooden slats, before landing in a heap on the earthen floor. Elias slammed the trapdoor shut and threw the bolt, sealing out the howling wind. The silence of the fortress rushed back in, broken only by Silas's ragged, wet gasps. The man who lay in the dirt bore little resemblance to the arrogant figure who had driven away 20 days ago. Silas was a wreck. His lips were the color of bruised plums, his skin waxy and gray. Ice matted his eyebrows and beard, melting now into rivulets of dirty water that ran down his face. He curled into a fetal ball, shaking so hard his teeth clicked together like dice in a cup. "Hypothermia," Miriam diagnosed, her voice clinical. She pointed to the horse blankets. "Strip him. Wet clothes kill." For the next hour, the dynamic of the cellar shifted into a strange, surreal ritual. The children stripped their guardian of his freezing layers, wrapping him in the rough, manure-scented blankets that belonged to the livestock. They dragged him closer to the stove, propping him up against a sack of feed. Silas couldn't speak. He could only stare. His eyes, wide and glassy, darted around the room. He saw the Holsteins chewing cud in the corner, their massive bodies radiating heat. He saw the neat stack of dried manure patties fueled by the very animals he had told them to ignore. He saw the crate of sprouted potatoes. He realized with a dawning horror that they hadn't just survived. They had thrived. "Drink?" Miriam said, holding a tin cup of hot water mixed with a mashed turnip. It wasn't a request. Silas tried to reach for it, but his hands were useless claws. Miriam sighed, a sound of impatience rather than pity, and tipped the cup to his lips. He choked, sputtered, and then drank greedily, the hot liquid shocking his system back to life. "Thank you," he rasped, his voice a broken whisper. I won't forget this." "We know you won't," Elias said, standing over him with the pitchfork. He wasn't threatening him exactly, but he wasn't lowering the weapon either. "Because you're not in charge down here, Silas. You're the liability." As the blood returned to Silas's extremities, so did the pain. He moaned, clutching his leg. Elias had splinted it as best he could with 2 pieces of firewood and a strip of rope, but the break was bad. "The deed," Silas mumbled, his eyes fluttering. "I told you. I'll give you the deed." Miriam sat on a milking stool across from him, opening her ledger. "We don't want your charity, Silas. We want the truth." She began to write. The scratching of her pencil was the loudest sound in the room. Silas watched her, a primal fear creeping into his eyes that had nothing to do with the cold. "What are you writing?" he asked. "The expenses," Miriam said without looking up. "Room and board, medical care, salvage fees." She paused, looking him dead in the eye. "And the record of events. Day 21, intruder, attempted entry. Intruder rescued from his own negligence. Intruder is currently consuming the orphan's rations. Silas shrank back against the feed sack. He realized then that he hadn't been saved. He had been captured. For 2 days, the storm raged above them, burying the collapsed barn under 6 feet of drift. Inside, the cellar became a pressure cooker of psychological warfare. Silas, unable to move, was forced to watch the twins operate their underground kingdom. He watched Elias expertly bank the fire. He watched Miriam ration the food, giving Silas the smallest portion, enough to keep him alive, but not enough to make him strong. He tried to assert authority once. "That fire," he barked on the second morning, wincing as he shifted his leg. "It's too low. Put another patty on. I'm cold." Elias didn't even turn around. "We have fuel for 4 days. The storm could last 5. Put on another blanket, Silas." The command died in Silas's throat. He pulled the scratchy wool up to his chin, humiliated. The man who had wielded the power of life and death over them was now lower than the livestock. At least the cows produced heat. Silas only consumed it. By the time the wind finally died down, on the 3rd day, Silas was a broken man. The pain, the confinement, and the terrifying competence of the children had stripped him of his ego. He lay in the dirt, watching Miriam make her final entry in the book. "It's quiet," Elias noted, looking up at the trapdoor. "The thaw comes next," Miriam said. She closed the ledger with a heavy thud. "Pack the gear. The sheriff will be coming." "To arrest me?" Silas whispered, hope and terror warring in his voice. "To recover bodies," Miriam corrected. "Let's make sure he finds the right ones." Sheriff Miller's cruiser slid sideways as he navigated the long, treacherous driveway to the Thorne property. The world was a blinding expanse of white, the sun reflecting off the snow with a brilliance that hurt the eyes. He wasn't coming for a rescue. He was coming for a recovery. A neighbor had reported seeing Silas Thorne's car buried in a drift near the collapsed barn days ago. Miller stepped out of his car, sinking to his shins in the slush. The silence was absolute. The barn was a heap of splintered timber and snow, a jagged scar on the pristine landscape. "Damn fool," Miller muttered, adjusting his hat. He signaled to his deputy to bring the body bags. "Greed doesn't keep you warm, Thorne." He was about to radio the coroner when he saw it. A thin, steady ribbon of gray smoke was rising not from the ruins, but from the ground itself, 10 feet away from the wreckage. It curled up into the blue sky, defiant and impossible. Miller walked over, his boots crunching through the crust. He kicked aside a pile of snow and saw the ventilation gap, a clever little chimney made of tin and stone. "Hello?" Miller shouted at the ground, his hand instinctively going to his holster. "Is anyone down there?" The snow shifted. A section of the barn floor, which Miller realized was actually a concealed hatch, pushed upward. Elias climbed out first. He squinted against the blinding sun, his skin pale from weeks of darkness, but his cheeks flushed with life. He took a deep breath of the crisp air, then turned back to the hole. "Easy now," Elias said, reaching down. Miriam emerged next, clutching a leather-bound book to her chest, like a shield. She looked at the sheriff, her expression unreadable. "We survived, Sheriff," she said calmly. "My God," Miller breathed, rushing forward. "You two, we thought you were in the city. Where is—" "He's down there," Elias said, pointing into the gloom. "He needs help." Miller and his deputy peered into the hole. There, lying on a bed of straw and horse blankets, looking up with the pathetic gratitude of a beaten dog, was Silas Thorne. "Sheriff," Silas croaked, tears freezing on his cheeks. "Thank God. Get me out of here. Please. Just get me away from them." Miller looked at the terrified man, then back at the 2 children standing tall and unbroken in the snow. He looked at the smoke, the hidden door, and the book in the girl's hands. "Deputy," Miller said, his voice hard, "get a rope. It looks like we have a situation here." Miriam stepped forward and held out the ledger. "You'll want to read this first, Sheriff. It explains everything." Miller took the leather-bound book, his thick fingers fumbling with the cover. He flipped through the pages, the crisp sound of the paper cutting through the icy silence. He read the entry about the lack of food. He read the entry about the lack of firewood. And then he read the final entries, a meticulous log of Silas's return, the collapse, and the rations consumed by the intruder. The sheriff looked at Silas Thorne, who was being loaded onto a stretcher by the deputy, shivering not just from the cold, but from a total, devastating loss of control. He looked back at the ledger. It wasn't just a diary. It was a crime scene report, written in real time. "Looks to me like attempted murder by neglect, Mr. Thorne," Miller said, his voice flat and hard as the Dakota permafrost, "followed by a rescue you didn't deserve." They held me prisoner," Silas stammered, his teeth chattering as the deputy strapped him down. "They took my coat." "They saved your life," Miller corrected, closing the book with a snap that sounded like a gavel falling. "And now? This book is going to ruin it." The investigation was short, brutal, and public. The town of Broken Vale didn't mourn the downfall of Silas Thorne. They watched it with the grim satisfaction of a prairie storm washing away dead wood. When the probate court convened in the spring, the judge reviewed the case. The evidence was overwhelming. Silas wasn't just stripped of his guardianship. He was charged with child endangerment and criminal negligence. The orphans were granted full emancipation and the deed to the farm, citing their extraordinary capability, resilience, and moral character. Silas Thorne spent the next 10 years in a state penitentiary, a place far colder than the root cellar he had feared. But the true punishment wasn't the prison bars. It was the knowledge that he was alive solely because his victims had decided he wasn't worth killing. He had to live every day knowing that two 12-year-olds had looked him in the eye, seen his weakness, and offered him charity instead of revenge. That mercy broke him more than the frost ever could. Elias and Miriam didn't sell the land. They didn't run back to the city. They rebuilt the barn, stronger this time, using the reclaimed timber from the collapse. They reinforced the roof with steel and built a proper farmhouse on the old stone foundation. Elias and Miriam stood on their porch that summer watching the green grass ripple in the wind like an emerald ocean. They were no longer the shivering twins from the orphanage. They were the thorns of the hollow. They had learned the hardest lesson of the American frontier. The land doesn't care who you are. It only cares if you're smart enough to survive it. And true power isn't about control. It's about having the strength to show mercy when your enemy is on his knees. What do you think, guys? Did Elias and Miriam make the right choice by saving Silas? Some might say true justice would have been leaving that bolt closed and letting the storm finish what he started. By saving him, did they prove they were better than him? Or did they just sentence him to a slower, more humiliating kind of death? If you were in that cellar, hearing the man who left you to freeze begging for his life, would you have opened that door? Let me know your verdict in the comments below. I read every single one, and I'm dying to know what you would have done. And if you enjoyed this story of cold justice and survival, make sure to smash that subscribe button and hit the bell icon. We have more stories of the dark and twisted side of history coming up next. And trust me, you don't want to miss them. Stay warm out there.